Я вітаю всіх, хто приєднався до нас. З вами Ольга Таманова.
Welcome everybody who joined us. I'm Olga Tamanova. Media Center Ukraine continues its work, and right now in our studio we have Malyar with us, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, and Serhiy Sobko, Chief of Staff of the Territorial Defense of Ukrainian Armed Forces. Ms. Malyar, let's discuss the operational situation on the front now. Good afternoon. Today, like the last time, we'd like to share information about the operational situation, current situation, and what the Ministry of Defense has been doing. Of course, the top issue today, issue number one, is the operation to rescue our fighters defending Mariupol, our defenders of Mariupol. And yesterday we already announced that this is a joint operation by several defense entities, including the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, Ukrainian Armed Forces, the National Guard of Ukraine, and the Border Control Service, Border Guard Service of Ukraine. Those agencies and units have jointly launched this operation, and yesterday we already mentioned its first stage, whereby 53 heavily wounded people had been evacuated. Also 211 people in more or less satisfactory condition have been evacuated, and this operation will continue until those people return to the territory controlled by Ukraine, by Ukrainian government. Also, we said that unfortunately it's impossible to unblock those people in military way, and there is no other way to rescue them other than the mechanism we have been using. That was the only solution. We have to remember again that the defenders of Mariupol, they include the National Guard, the National Police, Border Guards, and members of Ukrainian Armed Forces, including the 36th Marine Brigade, territorial defense of the city of Mariupol. And those people have implemented to the full extent their assignment. Due to defense by those people, we have prevented the enemy from bringing its troops, about 20,000 of personnel. The enemy has been unable to move those troops to other regions, so the enemy has been unable to quickly take Zaporizhzhia, city of Zaporizhzhia. The enemy has failed to create preconditions for siege of joint forces. And most importantly, the defense of Mariupol has provided us with sufficient time of critical importance to create our defense lines, to develop our reserve, and to implement other important actions in the course of our military operation. Now the rescue operation continues. This is a very sensitive topic, which means that we cannot share information about the details of that operation, because any information disclosure can spoil that process. Now I'd like to inform you about the work of our ministry from the 9th until the 16th of May, because the previous periods were described in our previous briefing. So from the 9th until the 16th of May, under the contracts centered by the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian Armed Forces received more than 23,000 of armored vests, more than 21,000 of helmets, more than 19,000 of uniform sets, and more than 6,000 of pairs of footwear. Today we expect 5,000 to 7,000 armored vests to come. What does it mean? When we say that those arrive, that means that when the Ministry of Defense passes those items to the logistics forces, logistics units, that means that this supply of 5,000 to 7,000 of armored vests has already been unloaded, has already passed the border, and it has already been documented, recorded. We purchase not only armored vests as such, but we also buy plates for them, and we order those armored vests to provide individual protective gear to our service members as fast as possible. Unfortunately, the Russian army has been trying to destroy our inventory, and our logistical facilities are hit also by missile strikes. So we have been making precautions to protect our resources. Of course, we cannot describe those measures, but people have to understand the threats, the danger for our resources, for our reserves. As of now, we, the Ministry of Defense, have achieved a situation where there are regular supplies of gear for Ukrainian armed forces, and we try to work in such a way that we should always have some reserve. Now about monetary payouts. Payments in the defense sector are made this month for the previous month. So if we are talking about the funds transferred by the Ministry of Defense to armed units in May, those are payments accrued for April. So at the first stage there is monthly payments, and then the second stage is additional payouts in wartime, in martial law, like 30,000 hryvnias for all service members, which you are aware of, and 100,000 for those directly engaged in combat action. On the basis of requests submitted by armed forces units, the Ministry of Defense has transferred 51.5 billion for April, and until the 20th of May, approximately, the armed military units have to accrue to pay those amounts to service members. About the medical forces of armed forces of Ukraine, in the last month they got 6 armored vehicles to transport wounded service members. Those vehicles have been allocated to assault forces and ground forces. Also, the medical forces of Ukrainian armed forces have got their tactical medicine school, and soon there will be the second graduation, and about 200 military medics will be ready to arrive to units of the Ukrainian armed forces. Thank you for attention, and you're welcome with your questions, and then Mr. Sobko will continue. Ms. Malyar, could you please tell us, speaking about international assistance, what percentage of that assistance has already arrived to the front lines? Indeed, there has already been some breakthrough. You all see that after the Ramstein meeting, where there were more than 40 leaders of defense ministries present, indeed, the assistance for Ukraine is now being provided in a joint way, and in several months Ukraine will get to parity level with those threats, because definitely Russia is now has now more equipment and more personnel. It's dangerous to describe exact numbers now, because the enemy monitors our information and they will understand our capability if you quote any numbers. But the fact is that the assistance supplied from the West, and it's already been used in the battlefield, that's true. Sweden and Finland joining NATO, how it will affect the general situation in your view? Our core task now is to win over the Russian Federation, to put that historical full stop, so to say, because our historical fight has been continuing for hundreds of years. So any process which can contribute to it is good. Dear colleagues, you are welcome with your questions for the first question. Please speak into the microphone.
Malyar, journalist from Greece. I want to ask you that it is reported that the soldiers of Azovstal that are evacuated are on a land under control of Russia. Is it true? And also, is it possible of the defenders of Azovstal there to be an exchange with military prisoners of Russia?
зараз. Вчора ми
Yesterday we said that heavily wounded people, and there are 53 of those, have been evacuated to Novozovsk, where they will be provided with medical assistance, and that's territory which has been currently temporarily occupied by the enemy. It's not controlled by Ukraine. And 211 people have been brought to Olenivka, which is again a territory which is not temporarily not under control of Ukraine. It's temporarily occupied by the enemy. And to further get those people to Ukraine-controlled territory, of course, we need some exchange procedure. Thank you. Any more questions?
Media in Italy, according to some website, in the Azovstal caves there are also foreigner fighter, American and English soldier, and maybe also Italian soldier. Is it true? Can you confirm this or not?
We can only use some restricted communication channels to provide such information upon diplomatic request of the respective country, because this is sensitive information. It may be dangerous for those people themselves. Thank you. More questions? I'm Yuri Stelansky from Ukraine Military TV. Could you please tell us, until the full-scale invasion, there was broad discussion about gender equality of men and women. So how did women master those military professions, and how they have acted during the active combat action? Thank you for your question. Indeed, there has been a very interesting trend in Ukraine, which we saw also in 2014 as well as now, whereby more women than in peaceful times have been joining the armed forces. And this is a very interesting peculiarity of Ukrainian women. They, jointly with men, have been defending Ukraine, and they have been mastering those professions which were traditionally considered. There was some stereotype that those are for men. And now Ukrainian legislation permit them to do it. There are no restrictions, and now our women are fighting the same way as men.
Press agency. I have a question about Azovstal too. So how many defenders are still in Azovstal approximately? Because I know that from obvious reasons it cannot take the specifics. And what are the chances to evacuate them too? Are you considering also exchange for Russian soldiers, which is in your hands right now? Thank you.
We know those numbers, and for you to understand it, we understand the scope of the rescue operation, but this is also sensitive information, and it is not disclosed until the end of the operation itself, of the rescue operation. Now, about the chances, it would not be the right thing to make any assumptions now, and it would not be the right thing to try and answer the question when this war will end. This is a process, and there are many components in this process which may change this process almost every minute. So the only thing we can say here is that Ukraine as a country is doing everything possible and even impossible in order to save our military. We are proud of them. They are our heroes. And now all those scenarios proposed in social media, proposed by experts, proposed by foreign politicians who are worried, all those scenarios we have made attempts to implement those scenarios. So today it's important to say that, and we hope that this operation, this rescue operation, will end well. More questions? Thank you. I'm Vitaly Golod from Ukrinform. Please tell us, today there has been some information from Russian State Duma, Russian Parliament, saying that they're going to make a decision to prohibit exchange of our soldiers from Mariupol in Russia. Do you think it's a provocation, or do they just make their statements for their internal audience, for their TV audience, or how it could affect further process about our soldiers? And my second question is this: do you have any information how many Russian prisoners of war we have here? Thank you. About the State Duma, the Parliament of Russia, that's a political statement for their internal propaganda and their internal political processes in the Russian Federation. We, in turn, can say that the negotiations process continues and the rescue operation now continues. Thank you. About prisoners of war, any numbers of Russian servicemen? About prisoners of war, since the 24th of February, Ukraine has developed mechanisms for the exchange of prisoners of war, fully in line with Geneva Conventions, which is very important. We have completely transparent exchange mechanisms with the involvement of the International Committee of Red Cross. And all information about prisoners of war is at disposal of the National Information Bureau. So currently the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine in functional terms is not in charge of that information. Thank you. Any more questions? I'm Nazar Voloshin for Ukrinform. Could you please tell us, recently there have been missile strikes against infrastructure in towns and cities, including the capital city. According to the last version, the president has said that 38 diplomatic missions have returned to Ukraine. How to close our sky, in particular above capital city, or has it been closed already? Russia becomes predictable, even though they tried to get that status of unpredictable enemy. They respond emotionally to any successes of Ukraine, including its international successes. And indeed, those missile strikes, rocket strikes, there is a risk of those all over Ukraine. This last night, you know that in some regions there has been a lot of such strikes, which is a sign of the situation. About the protection, our air defense, Ukrainian air defense forces, who were considered our weak point until the 24th of February, has shown that the enemy does not have superiority in the air. Of course, we cannot say that there is 100% protection. It would be a wrong thing to say, because rockets and missiles do hit certain sites, but there is an incomparably higher number of missiles which are downed and don't reach their targets precisely due to operations of our air defense. And by now it's about hundreds of thousands of lives saved. Two more questions, and let Deputy Minister go.
I would like to ask you about recent success in Donbas region, especially about defending rivers Severní Donetsk. There was in last week there was published about heavy fighting and destroying many pontoon bridges of the Russian army. They tried to cross the river. If you can comment, thank you.
I will even find some international news agency published something about it. Let me find it, just a minute. The matter is, yeah, that's the Brigadier Bilogorivka, which may become one of the biggest failures of Russian army. I think this is from the UK press. We don't have such titles, and I will explain to you why. The military operation, while it's ongoing, should not be disclosed, because the enemy adjusts its actions. So yes, indeed, sometimes there is some leak of information, some leakage, because we are in the digital world, and anybody who has a smartphone can send any information. But the information policies of the armed forces and the Ministry of Defense are as follows. For us, the security of that operation is more important than any quick that informing about the developments in at the front in a quick way. Yeah. So about trends, the enemy fails to surround our joint forces in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, in that region. They fail to do it. Although the enemy, the Russian army, has set a goal for themselves after they failed to take Kiev. They want to get to geographic boundaries of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And currently, with all those strong battles and shelling all along the front line, the Russian army still fails to achieve even this goal. The last question, you're welcome. Thank you for your information. I'm from Phoenix TV. Currently, in Kharkiv direction, the Russian army has started active counterattack, counteroffensive. When are you going to counterattack in other directions to push the Russian army away to liberate all those territories of Ukraine? Indeed, in Kharkiv area, it has been successful for Ukrainian armed forces, and the General Staff regularly informed about liberation of towns and villages, and we practically reached those borders, those boundaries of Kharkiv Oblast. At the same time, your question contains some intelligence component about plans of our armed forces. Of course, this information cannot be disclosed. Thank you, Ms. Malyar. And Serhiy Sobko, you're welcome, our next speaker. Serhiy is Chief of Staff of the Territorial Defense of Ukrainian Armed Forces. Serhiy, please tell us about tasks of the territorial defense since we have got the second stage of this war. Good afternoon, everybody. If I may, I would like to answer three most relevant questions, in my view, which now appear about the territorial defense of Ukrainian armed forces. The first question is this: whether the territorial defense forces can be engaged in combat action in combat areas on the first line, as we call it. The second one is about the weapons and gear and equipment of servicemen, of members of territorial defense in those combat areas. And the third issue, the third question, is about those worries or concerns we can see in those families of service members from Lviv Brigade, the Transcarpathian Brigade. They worry about service members who are in those difficult areas. So about the first question, I'd like to emphasize that territorial defense forces are a component of Ukrainian armed forces, like others, like ground forces, like air forces, like navy, like assault forces and others. And like all service members, those in territorial defense report to the Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian Armed Forces. They obey all his orders and instructions. I understand the nature of that question, because many citizens of Ukraine have this idea that territorial defense forces should only act for territorial defense, to implement territorial defense within their respective oblasts or districts. But that's not the case. This is a wrong idea, because the law of Ukraine on the basics of national resistance clearly establishes that if the Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian Armed Forces makes such a decision, units of territorial defense can be engaged in territorial defense as well as combat tasks all over Ukraine. And we have already had a huge experience of such actions. Our service members, since the very first day of full-scale aggression, have been actively involved in combat actions. Our units have been active, have played an important role in liberating Kyiv Oblast, Chernihiv Oblast, Sumy Oblast. And now there has been about defense of Mariupol for about 80 days, and as Ms. Malyar has already said, a number of units of Donetsk Brigade of Territorial Defense, jointly with their comrades in arms from other forces, are now still there with Azovstal. Kharkiv Brigade is a bright example. After a long successful defensive battles, they now participate in counteroffensive, counterattack. And as you know, the day before yesterday, they reached our state border in some place. So, by and large, out of 32 brigades of territorial defense, about 25 brigades have been fully or partially engaged in combat actions. About weapons and supplies for those units involved in combat actions, implementing combat tasks. It's important to understand that our units always act within those groups of forces under joint command. There is a joint idea and joint command and control. The territorial defense units are basically light infantry. They have lighter weapons than mechanized units, tank units, or even motorized infantry units. The commanders understand it and make timely decisions and provide them with heavier weapons like heavy machine guns, anti-tank missiles, grenade launchers, mortars, and portable anti-aircraft missiles. Also, since they work within certain forces, they also have fire support, artillery support provided by other units within those forces. Most preparations are, of course, done before that unit departs for the combat area, but there are cases, there are situations when those weapons that I mentioned in my statement is sent directly to those combat areas, and we have to do some additional training right there in back lines of those combat areas. About supplies, all those 100% of service members have their protective gear, they have helmets, they have armored vests, and medical assistance kits for themselves and their comrades in arms. The third issue is more sensitive, and I'd like to start by thanking all service members of territorial defense who have joined the defense of Ukraine since the 24th of February, who have joined the territorial defense. I'd like to sincerely thank you for your service, for your commitment, for your courage, for your bravery, for implementing all your assignments, for, you know, you have been defeating the enemy and you will be defeating the enemy wherever it's needed. I would also like to thank separately those from Lviv Brigade and Transcarpathian Brigade members. Those are people who have stopped and destroyed the enemy near Siversky Donetsk River, and now they continue active combat operations in other areas where the situation is not any easier. The very nature of this war is very difficult, and war is always about losses, is always about wounds, is always about blood, sweat, and tears. And the nature of those worries, of those concerns of families and near ones of our service members is very clear to us. And this is a certain challenge to us, but I am sure that we will jointly overcome those challenges. We will manage. So based on that, I'd like to say two things. First, what is most important for families, for near ones, is to be at par with your so those service members, with your husbands, with your brothers and sisters, they consciously joined the defense of Ukraine. And this situation it's very important for them to feel your support and love, to feel that you value what they are doing, because they are doing a lot of great thing for you. They are defending you, they are defending their families, they are defending their children, so the war will not reach your locations. So it's not worth undervaluing their actions by discussing their worries in public. Those worries will pass, but their heroic deed now and what they will do in the future is very important, extremely important for our victory. Second, sometimes we can hear that we will be defending cities in western Ukraine, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Uzhhorod. But today, Ukraine needs to defend itself in the east, because you can imagine, if you imagine that we are defending Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, or Ternopil, for example, then it will mean that we have lost most of Ukrainian territory. We have lost most of the country if you have to defend those cities. So now we have to be defending our country in the east and in the south. In other words, we have one war for everybody. We have one war for everybody, for all of us. We have one and the same armed forces for everybody. We have Ukraine, one Ukraine for everybody. And we'll definitely win. We'll definitely have victory. And our victory will also be one victory for everybody. So that in the future, we will look into each other's eyes, understanding that everybody has made maximum effort for that victory. Thank you. Is there any additional training for those territorial defense units who are relocated to the east? Yes. Yes. The peculiarities are this: we have to run the training in those conditions when we have already been implementing our tasks of territorial defense or other special assignments outside of combat areas. There are relevant plans. All those actions have been planned, and there are instructors involved, staff instructors in military units, as well as mobile training teams from various volunteer organizations and so on. And before, when we got orders to send our military units to the respective combat areas, we tried to use all the remaining time to improve the skills, to cover those gaps that people have in their skills, to train them as much as possible in situations that we have. Thank you. Any more questions? Please speak into the microphone. Thank you. I'm Vitaly Golod from Ukrinform. Thank you. Please tell us, there are those modern weapons coming from abroad, from other countries. Does it come to territorial defense or only to armed forces? Yes, I already mentioned the weapons that we additionally bring to our units: mortars, anti-tank missiles, grenade launchers, machine guns, anti-aircraft systems. We are talking about Ukrainian weapons as well as weapons received from partner countries. And my second question is this: about assignments implemented by territorial defense in other regions. For example, Kyiv territorial defense from Kyiv Oblast, which tasks does it implement around Kharkiv or in Donbass? I cannot answer this question specifically because of security reasons, but as I said, 26 out of 32 are brigades have been fully or partially engaged in combat action, so most of them by now. Any more questions? I'm Alexey Koval from Phoenix TV. My question is, you mentioned the numbers of territorial defense of 100,000 people. Will it increase? Will be increased, or what is the maximum, maybe the maximum number of service members, or the staff numbers have been approved and they will not increase? now the total numbers of Ukrainian armed forces, of territorial defense forces within Ukrainian armed forces has been about 110,000 people. Also, by now we have created more than 700 volunteer units of territorial communities which are not part of territorial defense forces, and we will maintain those numbers generally, but depending on the situation we'll have, it is possible that the decision will be made to create additional military units. Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. Thank you. No more questions. We had Serhiy Sobko for us, with us, Chief of Staff of Territorial Defense Force of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. Friends, I'd like to remind you that at 6 p.m. we'll have